She was 29 years old, newly widowed, and the only thing her late husband left her was 1,000 acres of cracked red earth and a horse no man in 3 counties had ever managed to touch. They said she'd be gone by winter. They said the ranch would go to auction before the first frost hit the valley. They said a lot of things. What happened instead became the kind of story people in Haskell Flats still talk about in low voices, the way you talk about something that doesn't fully make sense, but you know is true, because you were there, or because someone you trust was. This is that story. Before we get into this, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. Have you ever had a moment where everyone around you had already decided how your story was going to end? Where the doubt wasn't out there somewhere, it was right there, in your neighbor's eyes, in the way people stopped calling. Because that's exactly where Willa found herself. And there's a detail in this story, something that happened between her and that stallion on a quiet Tuesday morning, that I think is going to stay with you. If stories like this are why you come here, hit that like button right now, subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. All right, let's go back to Haskell Flats, Texas, the summer of the red dust. The thing about Haskell Flats is that it doesn't forgive weakness, never has. It's a stretch of eastern Texas that sits just far enough from everything that the people who stayed there chose to stay, which means they carry a particular kind of stubbornness in their blood. The summers are brutal, the winters are deceptive. The land takes more than it gives, and the only people who've ever made anything of it are the ones who refuse to quit, long past the point when quitting made sense. Willa Dacre had grown up about 40 miles northwest, in a smaller town that's barely a dot on the map now. She'd met Caden Dacre at a livestock auction when she was 22, and something about his quiet confidence, the way he moved through the crowd without needing to announce himself, had caught her completely off guard. They married within the year. She moved to Haskell Flats, and for 6 years they built something together on that red dust ranch that Caden had inherited from his father. People liked Caden. He was straightforward, worked hard, shook hands, and meant it. The ranch, they called it the Bracken, after the old family name on his mother's side, sat on just over 1,000 acres at the edge of a shallow ridge. It wasn't the biggest spread in the county, but it was well kept, respectable. Then 3 weeks before his 34th birthday, Caden Dacre drove home in a late evening rainstorm on Route 9 and never made it to the driveway. Willa got the call at 9:47 p.m. She was folding laundry. She still folds laundry the same way. The funeral was quiet. The grief was not, but Willa is not the kind of woman who shows you the worst of it. She keeps that in the private hours, in the pre-dawn dark when the ranch is still and there's no one to perform strength for. In public, she was composed. She thanked people for coming. She stood very straight, and then the public moved on, the way it does. Within 2 months, the questions started, careful at first, then less so, from neighbors, from creditors, from Caden's cousin Boone, who'd always had opinions about the ranch that didn't entirely match his distance from it. The Whisper network in Haskell Flats began running the math. She was young, no children, no immediate family in the area, and a ranch that required the kind of daily physical labor that 2 people had been stretched managing. She couldn't run the Bracken alone. That was the consensus. And then there was the horse. His name was Tuck. Short for nothing. That was just what the previous owner had called him, a man named Garvey, who'd driven out from Amarillo with a trailer and desperation in his eyes, trying to unload the animal before he caused more damage. Garvey told Caden the horse was green broke at best, that he had the bloodlines of something exceptional, but the disposition of a thunderstorm. Caden, because he was Caden, had bought him anyway. That was 4 months before the accident. In those 4 months, Caden had made exactly 0 progress with Tuck. The horse wouldn't lunge, wouldn't longe, wouldn't let a saddle pad sit on his back for more than 30 seconds before he was spinning and kicking. He'd put 2 experienced hands on the ground in the round pen. One of them, a man named Sayer, who'd been working horses for 20 years, left with a separated shoulder and a very different opinion of his own abilities. After Caden died, Willa was left with the land, the debt, 6 older working horses, 12 head of cattle, 1 border collie named Hex, and Tuck. The general feeling around Haskell Flats was that she should sell everything she could and go home to whatever was left of her people up northwest. That was the sensible path. That was the obvious path. Willa didn't take it. Nobody, at first, could entirely understand why. The first thing Willa did, the week after the funeral, was walk the entire perimeter of the ranch, not in a truck, on foot, alone, except for Hex, who shadowed her with the particular attentiveness of a dog who senses that something has shifted in his world and is working to recalibrate. It took her most of a day. By the time she came back in, her boots were red-caked to the ankle, and she had a notebook full of observations. What fencing needed attention, where the dry creek bed had started undermining the southeast pasture, which water lines were running pressure low. She hadn't cried during the walk. She'd taken notes. That was Willa. Her neighbor to the north, a weathered and plain-spoken woman named Odette, who was in her late 60s and had no patience for pretense, watched Willa walk back to the house that evening from across the fence line. Odette had lost her own husband 15 years earlier and had kept her place running through drought and falling cattle prices and a bad year that put 3 of her neighbors under. She didn't offer unsolicited comfort. She watched, nodded once to herself, and went inside. It was Odette who later told me, and I'm paraphrasing years of quiet observation when I say this, that she'd seen something in Willa's posture that evening that told her the girl wasn't breaking. She was measuring. The more vocal neighbors were less perceptive. Boone Dacre, Caden's cousin, showed up 11 days after the funeral with what he likely considered a generous offer. He was 41, ran a middling operation about 30 miles east, and had the kind of smile that worked on people who weren't paying close attention. He sat down at Willa's kitchen table with coffee he poured himself and explained patiently that the ranch would be difficult to sustain on her own, that Caden would have wanted the family land to stay in family hands, that he was willing to take the bracken off her at what he called a fair value. Willa let him finish. Then she said, "I know what fair value is, Boone, and I know what this land is worth. Come back when those 2 numbers match up, and we'll talk." He laughed like she'd said something charming. He left. He would be back. The hands were a more immediate problem. Caden had kept 2 full-time workers, a middle-aged man named Duff, who handled most of the mechanical maintenance, and a younger one, Wren, who'd been there less than a year and was still learning. When Caden died, Duff stayed because he was loyal and because he had a family in the area and no better options. Wren left within 3 weeks. He was young and he was scared, and Willa couldn't blame him. So it was her, Duff, and Hex, and 1,000 acres, and 12 cattle, and 6 horses. 7 if you counted Tuck, which operationally you couldn't, since he was contributing nothing but anxiety. She kept him anyway. People thought it was sentimentality, that keeping the horse was about Caden. Maybe that was part of it, but Willa, when she finally talked about it, said it more plainly than that. "I kept him because everybody told me he was worthless. I've never found that a good enough reason to give up on something." The financial reality was not comfortable. Caden had carried debt on the property, a sensible load by ranch standards, but one that required income to service. Willa had a narrow window. She liquidated what she could that wasn't essential. She sold one of the older horses that was retired from work. She drove supply costs down to a level that Duff quietly described as aggressive. She started selling eggs from 20 hens she'd kept near the barn, and that Caden had largely ignored. Evenings, when the work was done and the house was quiet, she read, not novels, land management guides, equine behavior studies, a battered paperback on natural horsemanship that had been sitting in Caden's truck for a year with the spine unbroken. She read the whole thing in 4 nights. She didn't go to Tuck right away. She watched him first. Every morning, coffee in hand, she'd stand at the round pen fence and just look at him. Not pushing, not asking, just being present. Tuck, for his part, mostly tried to ignore her, but on the fourth morning, he stopped pretending she wasn't there. He stood at the far end of the pen, and he looked back. Willa noted this in her notebook. She noted everything. It was Odette who first told Willa about Levi Strand. Odette didn't recommend many people. She'd seen too many people oversell themselves and underdeliver in situations that mattered. But Levi was different. She'd watched him work with a problem mare of her own 2 years earlier, and she said what he did wasn't training so much as conversation. He listened to the horse. He made adjustments based on what he heard. Willa looked him up. He was based in a small operation about 60 miles south, not well known outside of a fairly specific circle of horse people who passed his name around quietly. He didn't have a website. He had a phone number and a reputation. She called him on a Wednesday. He came out the following Monday. Levi was somewhere in his mid-50s, lean in the way that outdoor work makes people lean, with hands that looked like they'd been used hard for decades. He didn't talk much when he arrived. He put his truck in park, nodded at Willa, and walked directly to the round pen fence. He stood there for about 20 minutes. Willa stood beside him and watched Tuck watch them. Finally, Levi said, "He's not mean, he's scared." "Scared of what?" Willa asked. Levi glanced at her. "Being wrong. Same thing that makes most creatures difficult." He came 3 times over the following 2 weeks. He didn't ride Tuck. He didn't try to. He worked methodically through a process that Willa had partially read about, but now watched being applied with a quiet precision that was almost meditative. Pressure and release, movement and stillness. He was teaching the horse that the presence of a human didn't mean a fight was coming. On his 3rd visit, he let Willa stand in the pen, not doing anything, just standing. "He's been watching you every morning," Levi said. "He already knows you. You just haven't introduced yourself yet." That sentence landed somewhere deep in Willa. After Levi left that day, she went back to the pen alone. Late afternoon, the light going long and amber across the red dirt. She walked in and stood in the middle of the pen and breathed. Tuck moved to the far end. Classic. But she didn't chase him. She didn't step toward him. She just stood there, soft in her shoulders, breathing even and slow, and waited. 7 minutes passed. Then Tuck took 1 step toward her. She didn't react. She kept breathing. Another step. She had started crying somewhere in the middle of this and hadn't noticed until she felt the wetness on her jaw. Not grief crying, or not only that. Something else. Something that felt like a locked door, opening into a room you didn't know was there. Tuck closed the last 10 feet slowly, stopping twice, reading her. And then his nose touched her shoulder. She stood very still and let him smell her shirt, her hair, the side of her face. He breathed her in with those huge nostrils, and she let him, and the round pen was completely quiet. She didn't tell anyone about this for a while. She just went back. The next morning, the one after that. Meanwhile, outside the round pen, the ranch kept throwing problems at her with the reliable generosity of hard land. A water pump failed in the south pasture and cost more than she had liquid on hand. She worked out a delayed payment arrangement with the supplier, who respected that she came in person and told him the truth about the timeline. A stretch of fence line on the east border, weakened by summer erosion, went down after a hard rain, and she and Duff spent 12 hours in wet boots fixing it. Duff, who was not a man who offered compliments easily, told her on the drive back that she'd worked harder than any ranch hand he'd known. She said, "Then I've known the wrong ranch hands." He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh since Caden. Word got around, the way word does in small communities. Not the details. Willa wasn't talking. But the general outline. The widow was still out there. The bracken was still running. She hadn't sold, hadn't folded, hadn't gone home. Boondacre came back with a revised number. Still not fair. She sent him away again, and every morning, before the work started, she spent 20 minutes with Tuck. By October, something had shifted in the way Haskell Flats looked at Willa Dacre. It wasn't unanimous. Small towns don't shift unanimously. They shift in patches, the way drought gives way to green. Some people were still running the old story, young widow, hard situation, only a matter of time. But a different faction had begun to emerge, anchored mostly by the older generation, the ones who'd seen more than one improbable thing come out of difficult circumstances. Odette was at the center of this second faction, as Odette tended to be. She hosted a dinner that fall to which she invited Willa and 4 other women who'd all, at various points, kept something alive that the county had written off. 2 of them had held ranches through bad markets. One had run a feed supply through a drought that broke most of the competition. One, a compact and sharp-eyed woman named Harva, who was in her mid-70s and had a memory like a court reporter, had been told 40 years ago that the land she'd bought was untillable and had been growing sorghum on it ever since. Willa went to the dinner not knowing exactly what she was walking into. She left 3 hours later with something she hadn't expected, a network. Not a formal one, nothing organized, but a web of women who knew what she was carrying and had collectively figured out many of the same things she was just now learning. Harva, who did not waste words, told her 2 things that Willa has repeated many times since. The first, the land doesn't care about your grief timeline, but it's not trying to beat you either, it's just land. You work with what it gives. Or, the second, the people who told you this wouldn't work. They told someone the same thing about every useful thing you see around here. Don't confuse volume with accuracy. Willa came home from that dinner and sat on her porch in the cold dark for a long time before going in. The next morning, Levi called. He was ready to try the next step with Tuck. He asked if Willa wanted to be the one to do it. She said yes before he finished the question. The next step was simple in description and complex in execution, letting Tuck carry weight for the first time. Not a rider, a saddle pad, laid carefully across his back, allowed to sit there while he stood in the pen. Levi walked her through the progression methodically. The horse's comfort at each stage had to be real, not forced. The moment he tensed or shut down, you backed off. It took 3 sessions, not because Tuck was difficult, or not only that, but because Willa had learned by now to slow down, to read him. The first session she could feel him thinking about bolting when the pad touched his withers, and she pulled it back, and she let the moment sit, and they started again. By the 3rd session, he stood with the pad on his back for 11 minutes and didn't move except to swing his head around and look at her with an expression she'd come to recognize as something like, "All right then." Levi, leaning on the fence, said nothing for a while. Then, "You've got good hands, Willa, not just physically. The way you think, that's the harder thing to teach." She didn't know what to do with the compliment, so she nodded and kept her eyes on Tuck. That weekend, a man named Calloway stopped by the Bracken. He wasn't local. He'd driven up from somewhere south, and he came with a trailer, and he had the specific manner of a person who has researched what he wants to buy before arriving and expects the transaction to be simple. He'd heard about Tuck through a chain she never fully traced, maybe through Garvey, maybe through someone at a sale barn, and he offered her a price for the horse that was, objectively, meaningful. It was more than Tuck was worth on paper in his current state. Calloway knew horses well enough to see the bloodlines, and was apparently willing to bet on the animal's potential with different handling. Willa listened to the offer. She walked him out to the round pen, because she thought it was only fair to show him what he was actually looking at. Calloway watched Tuck for about 5 minutes. Tuck watched Calloway back with the particular flat look he reserved for strangers. "He's still a project," Calloway said. "Yes," Willa said. "I can take him off your hands. Make it easy." Willa looked at Tuck. Tuck's tail swished once, unhurried. "I appreciate the drive," she said. "He's not for sale." Calloway was surprised. He recalibrated, offered more. "Still no," she said politely. "But thank you." He left. Duff had watched from the barn door. When Calloway's truck and trailer pulled back down the gravel road, Duff walked over and stood beside her at the fence. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Duff said, "Caden would have done the same thing." Willa nodded once. "Yeah, he would have." December came in cold and difficult. The first hard freeze cracked a water line on the north side of the property and flooded part of the hay storage before Willa caught it at 4 in the morning. She and Duff spent most of that night in the cold working the repair, their breath coming out in visible clouds, their gloves soaked through by the second hour. At one point, somewhere around 2 a.m., standing knee-deep in a problem that hadn't existed at sunset, Willa laughed, not because it was funny, because there was something so consistent about it, the way the ranch kept finding new tests to administer, new things to ask of her. Duff looked at her like she might be losing her mind. She said, "It just never stops, does it?" He thought about it. "No, but you do get faster." She did get faster. By January, the worst of the financial pressure had softened, not resolved, not comfortable, but manageable. She'd brought in a small revenue stream from boarding 2 horses for a family from the city that wanted them kept through winter. She'd sold a load of hay at good timing, right before a price spike. She'd negotiated a restructuring of the primary land note that gave her 6 more months before the next major review. None of this had happened because of luck. It had happened because she'd mapped every problem, made every call, and refused to pretend that hope was a substitute for arithmetic. But the thing that began changing the larger story, the story as Haskell Flats understood it, wasn't the finances. It was the horse. In February, Willa rode Tuck for the first time. She'd been building toward it for months. Levi had been out twice more. They'd progressed carefully through every step, the saddle pad, then the saddle itself, then the girth, then Willa standing in the stirrup and just leaning weight without mounting, then sitting for 30 seconds at a time while the horse stood and processed. Each session had been an unrushed conversation. Each session had ended on Tuck's terms as much as hers. The day she finally sat in the saddle and asked him to walk, it was a cold, clear Tuesday morning. No one was there except Duff, who'd positioned himself with studied casualness near the barn, as if he just happened to be doing something nearby. Tuck walked, not explosively, not reluctantly. He walked forward with a long, reaching stride, and Willa sat very still in the saddle, and they made one slow circle of the round pen in the cold February light. When she pulled him up and stepped down, Duff was already walking toward her. He wasn't pretending to be busy anymore. He put his hand on the horse's neck. "How was it?" he said, his voice not quite steady. Willa thought about it. Like, we'd been waiting to get to that part. The story got out, because stories always do. Someone talked to someone, and by the following week there were people finding reasons to drive past the bracken, or stopping at the co-op and asking about the widow and her horse, or calling Odette to get the real version. What they heard was this: she'd taken the horse nobody could touch and put months of patient, thoughtful work into building something real with him. She'd done it while managing 1,000 acres, servicing a debt, burying grief, and refusing every offer to walk away. The reframing, when it came quickly. The people who'd been loudest about the obvious outcome now spoke in a different register. The one that had always been present. The one that says, "Well, of course, I always thought she had it in her." Willa found this both mildly irritating and not particularly surprising. Boone Draker called one more time in March, not with another offer. "Just to talk," he said. His voice was different. The easy confidence had gone out of it. She had a brief, courteous conversation with him. She did not gloat. That wasn't her way. The person she did tell in full was Levi. She drove down to his place in late March, ostensibly to drop off some equipment she'd borrowed, and they stood by his fence in the afternoon sun, and she walked him through the whole winter, the finances, the freeze, the hay, the offers she'd turned down. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You know what you did, right? With Tuck." "I learned how to listen," she said. He nodded. "You applied it further than the round pen." She thought about that on the drive home. She thought about the way the skills had transferred, the patience, the willingness to back off and try again, the ability to read what was actually happening rather than what she'd expected to happen. She thought about Caden, about the note in his truck with the unbroken spine, about how she'd read it in 4 nights while the house was quiet. She thought he bought it for himself, And I'm the one who read it. The County Agricultural Fair in Haskell Flats wasn't a large event by any standard. It was the kind of thing that mattered within its geography and nowhere else. Cattle judging, equipment displays, a small rodeo component that ran for 2 afternoons, and a working horse competition that had been part of the fair for over 30 years. Willa hadn't entered the competition. She hadn't planned to. She was at the fair because Odette had entered her sorghum in the crop division and had asked Willa to come. And Willa went to things that Odette asked her to come to. She'd brought Tuck because she took him most places now. He traveled well, better than he did anything a year ago. And the exposure was good for him, good for both of them. She was standing with him at the trailer, letting him settle into the noise and movement of the fairgrounds, when a man named Priwet, who ran the working horse competition, found her. He was apologetic in the way of someone asking a favor. One of the entries had withdrawn that morning, a trailer breakdown 2 hours out. The competition was going to run short. Would she consider entering, just to round out the field? It was informal. The point was the demonstration, the craft, not the competition itself. Willa looked at Tuck. Tuck looked back at her. He'd gotten very good at waiting for her to think things through. "What's the course?" she said. Priwet described it. Cattle work, separating a designated steer from a small group, keeping it cut from the herd, demonstrating control and communication. The kind of thing that measured not tricks, but genuine working relationship between horse and rider. It was exactly the thing she'd been building with Tuck for 11 months. "All right," she said. The word went around the fairgrounds in that efficient way of small communities. People found reasons to drift toward the working horse area. By the time Willa had tacked up and walked Tuck to the warm-up area, there was a crowd that was meaningfully larger than a working horse competition in Haskell Flats typically attracted. She was aware of them without being focused on them. She'd learned that trick from the round pen, how to be present to the thing in front of you, completely present, while the peripheral noise remained peripheral. Tuck walked into the warm-up area and looked around. He was alert, ears moving, reading the crowd, reading the cattle in the adjacent pen. But he was not alarmed. He'd learned to tell the difference between something genuinely dangerous and something merely new. She could feel him thinking. She'd learned to love that, the sense of him processing the world, considering, arriving at conclusions. It was nothing like the locked explosive tension of a year ago. It was curiosity. It was trust. Boone Dacre was in the crowd. She saw him in her peripheral line and didn't acknowledge it. She saw Odette, who had positioned herself at the fence with her arms folded and an expression of composed certainty. She saw Levi, who she hadn't known was coming, standing toward the back with his hat pulled low. She saw Harver, still compact, still sharp-eyed in a lawn chair near the gate. The first competitor ran. Competent, clean work, a good run by local standards. The second was rougher, the horse giving some resistance at the critical moments. Then Willa walked Tuck into the arena. The noise of the crowd dropped slightly. Not to silence, but to that particular quality of attention that means something has shifted. The steer they designated was a mid-size roan, quick-footed, intelligent enough to test a horse. Willa and Tuck moved into the group calmly, and she picked her target, and Tuck knew. She could feel it in the shift of his body under her. Exactly what the question was. What happened in the next few minutes was, by objective standards, very good working cattle work. But what it looked like, to the people watching, was something closer to a conversation. Tuck read the steer. Tuck read Willa reading the steer. He moved before she asked, not because he was running ahead of her, but because they had arrived, through 11 months of patient daily work, at a place where his understanding of her intention was fast enough to look like telepathy. The steer cut left. Tuck cut with it before Willa's weight had shifted. The steer tried to double back. Tuck was already there. Willa was still, centered, riding with her whole body rather than just her hands, the way you ride when the horse already knows what he's doing and your job is mostly to stay out of the way while being fully available. The crowd had gone quiet. Not politely quiet, actually quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a group of people are all watching the same thing and all understand, even if they don't have the vocabulary, that they're seeing something real. The run lasted about 2.5 minutes. When it ended, Tuck stood loose and blowing, easy in his body, and Willa stroked his neck once. There was a moment, and then the crowd made a noise that Willa described later as something between applause and something else, like when you hear a piece of music land right and you don't know whether to clap or just stay in it. She rode out of the arena and dismounted, and stood with Tuck, and people came to her, not in a mob, but in that careful, respectful way of people who've been surprised. Old Hava made it through the crowd with her slow, certain walk, and stood in front of Willa for a moment. "That horse couldn't be touched a year ago," she said. "It wasn't a question." "That's right," Willa said. Hava looked at her. "You know that it wasn't about the horse." Willa looked at Tuck's profile, the long, patient head, the ears soft and tipped slightly out. "I know," she said. The competition placed her first. She didn't need the placement to know what the run had been. But when Priwet handed her the ribbon, she took it and thanked him with genuine warmth. She walked back to the trailer. Levi was waiting there. He didn't say anything except, "Good horse." "Good horse," she agreed. They stood in comfortable silence while Tuck ate from his hay net with the uncomplicated satisfaction of an animal who had done his work and done it well. The bracken didn't transform overnight into something easy. That's not how it works. The land kept asking, the way it always had. The debt kept needing to be serviced. There were bad months and good months, and a late frost the following spring that took a piece of the budget she hadn't planned to spend. But the frame around the ranch had changed. Not in the county's opinion, though that had shifted too, but in Willa's own understanding of what she was doing there. She hired a second hand in the spring, a quiet young woman named Addie who had a natural feel for animals and who within a month had become the first person other than Willa that Tuck would reliably come to in the pasture. Willa took this as a sign of good judgment on both their parts. Duff stayed. He'd retired from other people's ranches twice before and kept getting pulled back in, and he told Willa once that this was probably the last one, but that if he was going to work for one more person, he was glad it was her. She gave him a raise she couldn't entirely afford and didn't tell him the arithmetic. Levi came out quarterly now, less to work with Tuck than to consult on the other horses, and sometimes to just sit on Willa's porch and talk about what she was building. He'd seen a lot of ranches. He said the bracken had the feel of something that was going to last. She entered the county fair competition the following year, this time intentionally. She and Tuck placed first again. The second year, a writer from an equine publication in Texas came out and asked to do a short feature. Willa agreed, mostly because Odette told her she should, and the piece ran in the fall with a photograph of her standing with Tuck in the round pen, the red dust at their feet, the light, the way it goes in that country in October, golden and honest. She got letters after that, more than she expected, from women mostly, some of them ranching, some of them not, who'd read the piece and found something in it that mapped onto their own situations. She answered every letter. Some of those correspondences became friendships. Boone Draker, to his credit, came to her one day without an offer, just to say that he'd been wrong. The conversation was brief and slightly uncomfortable, and she respected him for having it. She shook his hand and told him she hoped the Eastern operation was going well. She meant it. "I want to tell you something about what happened in that round pen. Not the first ride, but the first day Tuck's nose touched her shoulder." Willa has told this story a few times, and what she says is this. In the weeks after Caden died, she'd been operating on a kind of controlled numbness. Not denial exactly, but a deliberate tightening. A decision, mostly unconscious, to run on function rather than feeling, because feeling, at full volume, would have made it impossible to do the work. She'd walked the land and taken notes. She'd sat across from creditors and held her position. She'd listened to Boone's offer with a face that showed nothing. She'd been surviving, and survival in that particular mode requires a certain closing off. What Tuck did What standing in that round pen and waiting, breathing, being present eventually produced was the reopening. He hadn't asked her to perform anything. He hadn't needed her to be competent or certain or unaffected. He'd only asked her to be honest, to show up without pretense, to stop managing the distance between herself and what was actually happening. And in doing that, in learning laboriously how to be genuinely present with another creature, she'd also done it for herself. Grief doesn't leave, she told me once. You don't get over it and then you're fine, but you can let it be part of you without letting it run everything. I think that's what the horse taught me, how to let something be true without letting it be the only thing. The bracken, as of the last time I checked in, is not just surviving. It is carefully and quietly growing. A third employee, a small additional leased section to the south that Willa is grazing thoughtfully. A boarding operation that runs 6 horses through the winter. Plans, tentative but real, for a working horse clinic that she'd run with Levi in the fall. Tuck is 11 years old now. He is not the wild, terrified animal who put Sayer on the ground with a separated shoulder. He is a horse who has learned to trust, and who carries that trust in his whole body, in the way he moves, in the way he meets a new person, in the way he waits for Willa in the mornings, when she comes with her coffee and her 5 minutes of quiet. She hasn't stopped taking notes. People asked sometimes what Willa's secret was, what she'd done differently from the people who'd tried and failed with Tuck, or the people who'd tried and failed to hold land through grief and hard math and a town that had already written the ending. She never had a clean answer, because there wasn't one. But if I had to distill 11 months of watching her work into something you could hold, it would be this. She refused to let other people's certainty replace her own judgment. She didn't do it loudly. She didn't make speeches. She didn't argue with Boone, or perform resilience for the neighbors, or post anything on the internet about her journey. She just kept getting up in the morning. She kept showing up to the round pen with her coffee, and her patience, and her willingness to learn. She kept asking, what does this situation actually need from me right now? Not what should it need, not what would look right. What does it actually need? The horse was never really the story. The horse was the mirror. What she saw in it was her own capacity to be still in the middle of pressure, to read what was true rather than what was convenient, to build something worth building even when the audience had already left. The bracken is still there. Willa is still there. Tuck is still there. And on quiet mornings in Haskell Flats, when the light comes in low over the red ridge and the air is cold enough to see your breath, you can watch them in the round pen, a woman and a horse who learned the same language from opposite ends of fear. And it will look, if you're paying attention, like what it is. Something real, something patient, something no one else got to decide. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment. Tell me your city. Tell me what it made you think about. And if you know someone who needed to hear this today, send it to them. I'll see you in the next one.